Alrighty, and we're rolling on another episode of the Love That Podcast. My name is Diego, and I am your host. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in to another week's episode of the podcast. On last week's episode, we had a discussion about the current state of gun violence in the country, as well as remediations that have and could be taken by Congress, by the presidency, and by us, the people, the constituents that vote in representatives that then make the laws that influence our lives on a daily basis. I think it was a pretty well-fleshed discussion, not argument. And realistically speaking, I mean, I've had a couple people engage with the episode and let me know what they think. And overall, they've been in a similar way to me. They've been voicing their frustration and voicing their discontent and the uncomfortability factor really that persists among most people that have a genuine fear of, the possibilities that could happen. Gun violence in this country, unfortunately, is so commonplace that it takes place in our schools, it takes place in movie theaters and parades, and for a myriad of different issues. For those of you who maybe haven't been able to listen to that discussion, you can go back and listen to the previous week's episode where we had a discussion about the entirety of the topic. As far as moving forward, what can be done, further advocacy for gun reform can only really be done through Congress and through the government chambers of legislation. There has been progress on the Senate and Congress. They have passed a bipartisan attempt at positive gun reform that's strengthening red flag laws, strengthening requirements for permits, and these are all tactics made to hopefully put a stop, if not an end, to gun violence in this country. States like California, where Gavin Newsom has introduced laws that would allow for victims of gun violence to sue gun manufacturers, which is a law that has been proposed on a national level but doesn't have the garnered support for it. And the reason these laws have been very controversial and somewhat popular is because it's an aim at the gun manufacturers so that we can really put a stop to the bleeding, because unfortunately, when people die at the hands of gun violence, especially at the hands of people who should not be having these guns, like, for example, someone who is under the legal age, somebody who has mental disabilities, somebody who has been flagged for mental health issues, although it's important to note that, someone who suffers from mental illness is 10 times more likely to be the victim of gun violence rather than the violator in that situation. Although, the conservative side of the aisle is pushing this narrative of mental illness being the reason why so much gun violence happens, and remedies to it are, the traditional family, because that automatically has a correlation to bringing gun violence down, a traditional family, right? I just don't even know how and why these things are what they are. They're also propositioning and trafficking with this recycled theory that drugs or forcing people into gun violence, especially weed, is motivating people into violent crimes, which we know is not the case, and we know that it's absolutely false. It's just unfortunate on so many different levels that this is exactly where we are in this part of history and this moment in time. Like I said on the past podcast, what can be done is strengthening our legislative branches, our presidential branch, and trying to move towards reforming the Supreme Court, because as it stands right now, they have overturned a law that prohibits carrying a gun in an open space. Now in the state of New York, they overturned the law and you can have a concealed weapon without a license anywhere, and that is supposed to be legal. We also have instances where we have people who are driving over state lines to go into states where you can purchase a weapon more freely and easily, and then bringing them and trafficking them over into states where they have stricter gun laws. This is how we have instances like the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, in which he took his underage ass carrying a weapon that he had no businesses having, and then using this whole protect and serve mantra, Good Samaritan trope, to carry out violence and kill protesters. We're also seeing this. We had a recent shooting in which a civilian who was carrying shot down the active shooter, and it's being hailed as a hero act. And to some extent, I can possibly see that. I'm having a little bit of trouble digesting that story and really coming to like concrete feelings about it, because a lot of the details are missing, and I have a lot of trouble with certain people getting to decide who and what is a good Samaritan and good civilian, because I don't know if they would be as happy if a black or brown person, especially a man, were to be the one to decide who is good and who is not. It's just a lot of things to consider, frankly, and it's a lot of moving parts, especially when you put into play that, this kind of argument only really benefits white people. Black and brown people don't usually get the benefit of the doubt in this country, which is why we have such a huge problem with policing in this country in the first place, because of all the prejudgments, stereotypes, and generalizations that move through the police force as an institution and as a living, breathing entity. So that's a lot of recap from last week's episode. This week, we're going to have a discussion about what movements have gone on in the country so far, revolving a myriad of issues that we've been talking about, like a revolving door of topics that we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks. So I just want to give a couple of updates on stories that we've been following throughout the last couple of weeks, give you a rundown of that, and we're going to move on into the Love That segment for the week. So let's get started and move on into the discussion for this week. Alrighty, so we have been talking over the last couple of weeks about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and even before that, we talked about the SCOTUS leak that prepped us for the impending overturning of the precedent, the 50-year precedent. In the time since then, President Biden has then signed a executive action decision that aims at protecting access to reproductive healthcare services. That's literally the name of the executive document that was signed by the Office of the Presidency. And I'm getting all of this from the federalregister.gov, which is a daily journal of the United States government and the actions that are taken by the different branches and offices. It's an actually pretty incredible website, so I'm going to include it in our link tree. So once again, just go ahead and hit that link tree. There's tons of resources out there. There are fundraisers for victims of the Buffalo shooting, as well as Uvalde, for resources, for voting and registering and knowing when your dates are, who are your constituents, who are your candidates, all types of stuff, as well as resources to link to different ways to listen to the podcast, as well as follow us. So make sure that you guys are up to date on all of that, because there's tons of great stuff that is available. So moving forward, so President Biden signed the Protecting Access to Reproductive Healthcare Services, and it was sectioned out. It's an entire PDF. I think it's it's only like 3 pages. So I'm going to read through a little bit of it. Section 1, policy. Nearly 50 years ago, Roe versus Wade articulated the United States Constitution's protection of women's fundamental right to make reproductive health care decisions. These deeply private decisions should not be subject to government interference. Yet today, fundamental rights to privacy, autonomy, freedom, and equality have been denied to millions of women across the country. Eliminating the right recognized in Roe has already had and will continue to have devastating implications for women's health and public health more broadly. Access to reproductive health care services is now threatened for millions of Americans, and especially for those who live in states that are banning or severely restricting abortion care. Women's health clinics are being forced to close, including clinics that offer other preventative healthcare services such as contraceptive measures, leaving many communities without access to clinical or critical reproductive healthcare services. Women seeking abortion care, especially those in low-income, rural, and underserved communities, now have to travel to jurisdictions where services remain legal, notwithstanding the cost and risks. And this is, we've talked about this before on the podcast. We talked about how the banning of abortion and the overturning of Roe v. Wade would most affect people that are at the margins, people that already don't have health insurance or already don't have access to cost-effective health insurance, that, you know, are already living check to check and don't have the money for extra expenses, you know, especially costly ones that have to do with your body and your healthcare. You know, these are procedures and these are parts of healthcare that are super important and worth the money that is required of it, because you can't just be doing back alley abortions, because that can really rise up the mortality rate, which is what we've been talking about, that this is going to force people into archaic ways of having healthcare. And it's 2022. We live in the United States of America. We need access to healthcare of all types, and it should not have to be any contest about it. Okay, I'm going to continue on reading. In the face of this health crisis, the federal government is taking action to protect healthcare service delivery and promote access to critical reproductive healthcare services, including abortion. It remains the policy of my administration to support women's rights to choose and to protect and defend reproductive rights. Doing so is essential to justice, equality, and our health, safety, and progress as a nation. So Section 2 has definitions, which is the term agency means authority of the United States government, that an agency under 44 USC 35021, other than that one, considered to be an independent regulatory agency. The term reproductive healthcare services means medical, surgical, counseling, or referral services related to human reproductive system, including services related to pregnancy or the termination of pregnancy. Protecting access to reproductive healthcare services. Within 30 days of the date of this order, the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall submit a report to the President identifying potential actions to protect and expand access to abortion care, including medication abortion, and otherwise protect and expand access to a full range of reproductive healthcare services, including actions to enhance family planning services such as access to contraceptive, identifying ways to increase outreach and education about access to reproductive healthcare services, and launching a public awareness initiative to provide timely and accurate information, such as access. And this is to be obtained free or at reduced cost reproductive healthcare services through health resources and services administrations funded by health centers, Title X clinics, and other providers. So this is basically just giving a broader definition about what exactly they mean by the statement that was given. So this is going to fund not only initiatives that are going to bring broader awareness to access to reproductive health care and services, but also actually fund the healthcare providers. This is like Planned Parenthoods, health clinics all over, doctors, and protect legal funds when cases are brought up against them. We're seeing now cases of doctors being sued by the states, the governors, what have you, because they live in districts or they live in states that are predominantly Republican and therefore pro-life. And they're doing so, bringing up charges of, conspiracy to commit murder, because this is how the Republicans are trying to push a narrative, something that is very cut and dry and very this and that. This is not murder. This is healthcare. This is not fair that only a certain part of the population, and that is the part of the population that is able to give birth, is villainized and scrutinized to this extent for making decisions about their bodies, when men are unchecked about their bodies constantly, and when there is issues, they're allowed access to remediation, allowed access to healthcare without, question, given that they are not of, trans identity, right? Because trans healthcare is a totally different issue, which is another reason that we have that conversation, because I just like to make the point that when people like myself or other people talk about trans people, or we talk about trans Black people, or we talk about LGBTQ people or other marginalized folks, and we talk about what they're going through, a lot of the times people that are not that specific identity that we're talking about might feel triggered in a way and might rebuttal and say, well, what about X? What about Y? What about Z? What about me? And the reason why a lot of the time that people talk about other marginalized identities, or the most marginalized identities, the reason that they talk about them is because when you take a step back and you consider what is being discussed, like, for example, so many times, and I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm going to circle back. This is all going to have a through line. If you circle back to our discussions on this podcast that we've had before about trans rights and what's affecting trans people in the day-to-day, a lot of people, maybe even some of you who were listening at the time, often thought, well, this is a new thing, like we shouldn't have to consider trans people that much, because at the end of the day, there's still people that are struggling, there's still people that are going through this or have been going through this, blah 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 blah, and can make arguments, and you can put different identities in different places and make those arguments. And while at some level there may be a little bit of validity, a little bit of truth in that, realistically, when you consider that transness is an even more marginalized identity than both of the cisgender identities that we have, which is cisgender man and cisgender woman, when you consider the fact that trans people have a much higher mortality rate, are being brutalized, especially if they're trans women of color, Black trans women, or brown and BIPOC, when we talk about that, it's because when those at the, it kind of goes back to the saying that we're not all free until we're all free. It's very much that same ideology, that same framework being displayed, and because it's the truth. Because when Black trans women are brutalized, when their violence, their murders go without discussion, and it suddenly turns into victim blaming, and somehow those who end up dead are turned into the villain instead of those that brought death upon them. And that is something that is a common thread when we talk about things like police sanctioned violence, when we talk about police brutality, when we talk about the Black female mortality rate when giving birth in hospitals, when we discuss the lack of care for the people and the children of Flint, Michigan that still have toxic water that they're drinking, that they're dying from. All of these things have a through line, not just because of race, but because it follows it builds off of one another. Because when we allow for Black trans people to be brutalized and murdered and lynched on the street in 2021, 2022, when we allow that to happen and nothing gets said about that because we hate trans people so much, or we have such a fear of them because we don't know anything about them and we don't care to. When we accept that dehumanization, it then permeates, because white supremacy, white nationalism, racism, colonialism is predicated on suppressing and extracting from what can be perceived as the most marginalized, or made to be the most marginalized, and justify that abuse and justify that brutalization by any means necessary. And they're often the same tactics, scapegoated. And that is the same through line that happens when we accept the overturning of basic human rights for anybody, given whatever gender they are. We overlook the rights of any gender within the patriarchy, understanding that most of the time that falls on the backs of people that are women and don't align with the gender binary. So basically, men are not affected by gendered violence at the same rates that women and non-binary people or trans-identified people experience, because in a patriarchal society, men are the predicators of the ideology that creates the violence, or it allows it to continue to exist, and then everybody subsequently just goes along with it to survive. This is what we talk about on the podcast consistently. We accept the rights being stripped away from a certain sect of society, so then we accept it happening to anybody. So we accept the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now the next thing that's going to happen is that we're going to overturn affirmative action. We're going to be stripping back all of the perceived quote unquote privileges that have been garnered over the last century in civil rights cases. And it's all going to happen through the Supreme Court, and it's going to happen on the backs of people who voted for Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton back in 2016, and those that voted for him and continue to tote this big lie, a conspiracy to commit a coup that's being broadcasted on national television through the January 6th insurrection committee that's investigating the crimes committed on January 5th and January 6th, and basically every day after, because they're still lying about this stuff. It's all a through line. It builds off of one another. This is not case by case basis. This is not, one thing is independent of another. This is very much a situation in which they build upon. Donald Trump ran off of getting conservative justices in the Supreme Court, knowing that the Supreme Court was an aging Supreme Court, because most of these appointees come after, decades long careers that are super, super qualified, which is why, we accept them as lifetime appointees, because we're like, okay, they're super dedicated. They were at Harvard for 50 years and they did this and they did that and they did that. Okay, they can judge some cases. We get it. But Donald Trump moved in an era and moved us into an era where he put in justices for the mere fact that they were going to align with his values and with the values of his constituents and the people that backed him and what they wanted to see in the world. Even though most of the time these conservatives don't have the same values that they taught, people that vote for him or vote for them in general, people that vote for conservatives or vote for these traditional quote unquote family value, party values, whatever bullshit, most of the time they don't even subscribe to the stuff that they're talking about. They're just paying lip service and knowing that they have a huge following because of religious reasons, quote unquote moral reasons or ethical reasons, and they know that people are going to follow them. So it's just incredibly, incredibly sad, and it's just a joke, and it's so unfortunate that that's the place that we're in. In coming 360 back to my original point, the reason that I talk about all this stuff is because there's a definite through line. What happens to trans people affects people of all races, and it affects people of mostly all genders, because we live in a patriarchal society that has rigid rules, and those rigid rules apply to all of us, not just some of us. It only applies to some of us if you, qualify under the quote unquote norm. And we still have institutions in the society, and we still have people fighting to keep these institutions in society. We often are told, oh, we're so advanced, we're not the same as we were 50 years ago. No, actually we are, because now we're back to square one, fighting for the right for and access to safe and sound abortion. Like, that's where we are. So yeah, we're back where we started. We take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. That's just the way that it has worked, because the institution does not want to break. It doesn't want to be redone. We're still seeing people die at the hands of gun violence because gun manufacturers and people that make money off of the sale and the culture of guns won't allow it to happen. They don't want the money pig to be cooked. It has to stay where it is. So the reason why we talk about different identities and different situations and what people are going through is because it affects me, it affects you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the day after next, they could be coming for us. That is why we have to stick together. That is why allyship is important. That's why it's important to have a greater understanding of yourself and also the people around you and what they're going through, because we often share commonalities and common goals. And if we had greater vested interest in achieving them, we could see greater fruits of that labor in this country that we deserve to see and that we deserve to pass on to future generations, to our nieces, to our nephews, to our children, to the children of our children, And this goes for a myriad of issues. This goes from societal rights, civil rights, to healthcare, to climate change, all of that. It's super, super important. Alrighty, so the next important topic of discussion that I felt pertinent to rehash and talk about the updates is the Uvalde, Texas massacre that occurred in Uvalde, Texas at the hands of the Uvalde police force. And I want to read updates from an NPR article titled, these are the 4 key takeaways from the Uvalde shooting investigation report. And this is an article by Ayana Archie and Emma Bowman. So it states, when an 18-year-old gunman targeted an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, quote, systematic failures and egregiously poor decision-making, end quote, on behalf of law enforcement and school officials failed to stop the shooter from killing 19 students and 2 teachers, a new investigative report found. Hundreds of law enforcement officials prioritized their own safety over the lives of students and teachers that day. And this is as they waited over an hour to confront the shooter, according to the 77-page report of the Texas House of Representatives Committee. And this is after weeks of conflicting and inconsistent accounts of police response. The report gives the public the most complete picture of the May 24th massacre at Robb Elementary School, as police fumbled without clear leadership, organization. School staff had grown less vigilant, straying from locked door policies and active duty procedures. There were multiple systematic failures, and some of the same systems that are found here in the school systems and in the police force are what contributed to what fail across the country. The implementations and how we handle active shooters, how we handle gun violence in this country, all of that is part of what ended in tragedy that day. The way that we view guns, the way that we handle guns in this country contributes to the amount of violence and the violence that was inflicted on that particular day to these children. So it's very, 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 very saddening and sickening to see. In all, 376 law enforcement officials arrived at the scene that was chaotic and uncoordinated. The group of federal, state, and local officials lacked any clear leadership, basic communication, and enough urgency to take down the gunman. And this is all according to the committee. After arriving to the school, Pete Arredondo, who was the police chief who was in charge on that day on May 24th at the Rob Hill Elementary School, who was in charge of the response, who was supposed to be, he was elected to the city council position, but has now since been put on administrative leave and resigned from his position at the city council because of the severe backlash, because of his lack of response and lack of leadership skills that resulted in the murder of all of these people. And it's just it was just horrible. So I'm going to continue on with discussing what this says. So after arriving to the school, Arredondo fumbled around with and eventually abandoned his radio at the fence, reasoning that one of the other sergeants was on the scene was fully uniformed with radio, and he testified that to the committee. While the school district active shooter policy called for Arredondo to be the incident commander who would have been responsible for leaving the building in order to organize a response and to inform other officers that he was in charge. Instead, he stayed inside of the building. After he entered the school, he went to the classroom. He had noticed that this classroom had bullet holes, but no children were inside. And then he quote unquote prayed that the kids in rooms, in the subsequent rooms where the gunman had fired over 100 rounds, had been emptied as well. And they had not been. And then he proceeded to handle the incident as one of a barricaded subject instead of an active shooter, which is an earlier report that we talked about, in which basically he handled the situation wrong. He handled it as a hostage situation and acted and was telling people to act as if it was a hostage situation versus a active shooter situation, which can bring up incredibly different results and tactics as a result of that. In addition to that, the report found that other responding officers and officials and response units that were on the scene, part of the 376 people that were on the scene, supposedly doing something for these children and the families, which we saw that they weren't doing anything, because we saw the videos of the police restraining parents that were frustrated and felt the urge to go in and save their children, where they saw that the people that are supposed to protect and serve were not doing any of that. The report found that those responders didn't do anything, were not proactive, were not taking initiative, where they saw a void of leadership that should have been filled. They weren't asking appropriate questions. They were being very lackadaisical. And there are early reports that there are videos showing them on their cell phones, pacing back and forth, even within inside of the school. In the background, you're hearing gunshots, and you can also there's also rumors that in the video you can hear the children screaming in the background, and it's incredibly heinous to have to talk about it, and it's super difficult to talk about it, but it needs to be said, because so often we're told in different situations that the police are the only response, and their job is super difficult, and their job requires them to make great decisions, and they're always the best at what they do, and they have the best responses and the best tactics. And unfortunately, we see time and time again that the police do not have all the answers. The police are not equipped enough. And my question that I arise to everybody is like, when is enough enough? When is there enough money for the police for them to adequately respond to situations that they should be prepared for? You know, it's like the police are more prepared to respond to criminal activity than they are to civil activity or saving children, like brown children in Uvalde, Texas, at Rob Hill Elementary School. Unfortunately, in this country, the police are more focused in budget, in purpose, in theory, in ideology, in harboring and filling the prisons to fill this prison industrial complex that we have here within the United States than they are with saving and serving the community, which is what supposedly the police are supposed to do, which we know that is the case. I'm being very sarcastic about it because it's a joke. It's beyond that. Border Patrol, the police officers, none of them could do anything about this one shooter. 376 of them could not do anything about this one shooter, but we're supposed to stand with them and respect them, and they're owed all of this because of why. It's beyond me. And now they're pushing these narratives of like, okay, well, the police aren't going to be able to stop everything, and we can't take away the guns because that's part of the Second Amendment. But if we arm teachers, then that'll stop gun violence. Or if we allow people to conceal weapons or have concealed weapons on them all the time, then they can stop shooters, and that'll be the reason why. And it's not okay. It's not okay. We need to take the AR-15, any assault rifle, off the market. We need to take it off. We need to make sure that we have reinforced red flag laws, reinforced gun safety laws, licensing and vetting of those licenses. And we need stricter laws, and we need stricter repercussions for offenses and for these gun manufacturers, because this story is so heartbreaking. It is unclear at this point, but you can probably be safe to say that charges will be brought against the police and responding officers. I don't know about specifically, or just the organization in general. And this also goes into my point that I was talking about earlier about the police in general. It's like the majority of their budgets go towards paying restitution and fees and damages and all of this stuff from their intervention versus re-education and like an actual redistribution of their budget and allocating their budget in a way that actually would make the police a lot more productive and a lot more aligned with what they say their tenets are, which are to protect and serve the civic people that pay their salaries. They don't run us, they respond to us. It's a totally different climate. The police have a very warped perception of who they are and what they represent in this country. And it's about time that we realize that the way that the police are right now are not working for us, not keeping our children safe, not keeping us safe, not protecting others in the proper ways. And that needs to be reformed. If there's an issue, we need to find a remediation for it. Just as a reminder again, there are links in our link tree to call your representatives and ask for more reform on guns to better secure our children, ourselves, one another, and just keep the protection going and the fight going against this battle of the gun manufacturers. I'm thinking of recently I was watching The View, and they had Gabby Giffords, who was a congresswoman who was also a victim of gun violence in a grocery store. The symbolism and the similarities in the story are unfortunately a commonality that is here in the United States with this gun epidemic, because it's a singularly American issue that we have of just surplus of guns and surplus of violence as a result of gun ownership. And she talks about the need to fight, for more reform and for a return to a banning on the assault rifles, which is, one of the root causes, the overturning during the Bush era presidency, the overturning of the ban on assault rifles saw the increase in gun violence that we are seeing today because of the exact weapon that is being used in every single one of those mass shootings, which is the assault rifle. So I thought that was very, very important to share. And like I said, we have links in the link tree to talk to your congresswoman, and also it has a link to it has like a spreadsheet where you can call the number and you can have the script ready so that you can address the issue that you want to talk about, given who your senator is, and let your voice be heard. Make sure you're registered to vote. It's all very, very important. The next important item that I wanted to discuss briefly, because we've talked about it ad nauseum, and it's a very cut and dry issue, just like most of the stuff we talked about, but nonetheless, the January 6th committee has revealed more evidence against Donald Trump and his administration for their involvement in the insurrection and the failed coup attempt on January 6th in an attempt to steal the election from Joe Biden, the then disgraced, twice impeached former president. Decided that he was going to negate all evidence of his loss and overturn states that he felt that he could somewhat control, even though was voted against. Basically, states like Georgia that came in, and because of the mail-in ballots, voted in high majority blue. He tried to overturn with the attorney generals. He tried in different states to overturn the elections and overturn the counts, something that he's being sued for by the company that oversees the validity and efficacy of the voting, which is Dominion Systems. He's being sued, and Fox News is being sued for, I think, over like billions of dollars. And in addition to that, the January 6th committee has garnered more evidence that the Secret Service has deleted text messages from January 5th and 6th and scheduled a factory reset of devices, which is going to make it harder for the public to access those and the committee to access those records, even though I'm assuming that it wouldn't be incredibly difficult for the federal government to find something if they really wanted to. In addition to that, you have testimony from White House officials, press secretaries, the inner circle that day that were aware of the violence that was ensuing on the Capitol building, something that the then president refutes and says that he wasn't aware of any violence that was ensuing and just protests for peace and for him, and it was peaceful protest. I mean, we haven't seen that kind of attack on the Capitol since the Civil War. We're talking about an attack that has never, ever happened, and an attack that will never be allowed to happen for any other group other than the group that was there that day, which is white nationalists that were seeking to behead the then vice president for not going along with the coup attempt. And, you know, we had officers being killed. Remember, we believe in police lives matter, but not in this particular instance. And I know a lot of people are really over the conversation of the insurrection and are just ready to move on. But the fact of the matter is, just like we talked about with these other issues, if we turn a blind eye to this, what are we now saying that we're open to receiving down the line? What is left? What more can be done? You know, that's the question that we ask. Oh, well, how much more far can they take it? It's like they tried a coup attempt. This next time they're going to actually steal the election. And if we are not vigilant and advocating for ourselves and voting for ourselves in our best interest, they will do this again, and we will have to suffer the repercussions of it. So that's why it's super important to be engaged and realize that this is like beyond crazy. Like, this is the stuff that we thought we would never see and never have to deal with, but okay, we have to deal with it, and we need to deal with it. It is what it is. It's just facts. There's more testimony to be given out in prime time next week, and there will be more inner circles, more people from the inner circle that were working that have even, I think some of them even resigned that same day, January 6th, and we'll give testimony about why Pence didn't get in the Secret Service van, because there's rumors that the then president was instructing the Secret Service, to kind of barricade him and keep him at bay in order to kind of like suppress him, kind of shelter him, keep him away from the ability to go through with the certification of election, which is just really, if you think about it, and they've reported on it, the whole idea that he was trying to obstruct the counting of the votes, that really is just a formality, and there's not really something that Pence could have done. Like, the only thing that really could have happened is like if there was an actual massacre that took place, if they actually went through with the violent portion of what they were trying to do and not just the civil obstruction that they were committing. If we focus on the violent part of it, that would have been the scary part, you know, because we're talking about things that happen outside of the US that we critique all the time and we use as an excuse for American intervention in those countries, which is like regime takeovers, coup attempts, the military, certain parts of the military taking over, and certain generals doing this, and that kind of stuff. This is the stuff of terrorists, domestic and international. And it's important that we realize that someone like this can never occupy the presidency, and somebody that believes in this kind of person or the kind of tactics that were used cannot be anywhere close to public service or public office or any sort of position of power ever. Point blank, period. So we're going to be sure to be keeping everybody updated here on the podcast about the events that unfold from the January 6th committee hearings and what else comes against the former twice impeached, disgraced former president, and any charges that will be brought against him and his conspirators. We're looking at the trial of Steve Bannon and his refusal to show up to a court mandated hearing, and his denial or refusal of a warrant, basically. Or no, a subpoena. He basically negated the subpoena that was given to him by the January 6th committee, so he's being brought up on charges for evading a subpoena. This is all very important and relevant because of how this is going to play out with the midterm elections that are coming up in November. Once again, Dire Tribe, vote, vote, vote. If you're not voting, you're not participating. And if you're not participating, you have no really stake in complaining about anything, really. Because it's like, you got to do your part. We all have an opinion. We all have an ability to affect change. So let's do the bare minimum. And the above and beyond is getting involved in pressuring your senators so that they hear in numbers and see in voices that change is needed, especially for these important issues. This is really not something that we should be having to do, but unfortunately this is like where we're at. We thought that our ancestors had done the groundwork so that we could build off of that, but the regression is very real, and so we need to get our hands dirty a little bit and do a little bit of the groundwork that they used to do back in the day. And so advocating is the easiest way. Links are in the link tree, like I mentioned. We're going to move on into the Love That segment for this week, bring in the wind chimes, talk about something nice. So just make sure y'all are on the lookout for any updates. Make sure to check out the social media handles. That's where we'll be posting any updates. Alrighty, let's move on into the Love That segment. Alrighty, so for this week's Love That segment, I wanted to discuss what I've been enjoying this week. Y'all know that I go back and forth between music, watching shows, all that kind of stuff. Right now I'm kind of in a housewives kick because a lot of things are in season right now, and like I had mentioned before, Real Housewives of Dubai, really enjoy Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and Real Housewives of Atlanta. It's been really enjoyable, but that's like more like nighttime activities, watching TV, winding down. But during the day, what I've really been enjoying is this playlist, on Spotify. That was, it's like a, what's it called? Callback, like a replay kind of really fun songs from like R&B, hip hop of 2004, 2007. We're talking about like Sierra, like Goodies era, Khalees. We're talking about like old Pitbull. We're talking about like 50 Cent. Like we're talking about Too Short. We're talking about Busta Rhymes, Mariah Carey. Like we're talking about Little John. We're talking about them Franchise Boys. Like like old school stuff. And I hadn't listened to it in a while, and it's like so nostalgic because it's so not what is hip hop right now, and what we know rap and hip hop to be at this current juncture in time. But it's just so fun. It's just a lighthearted kind of like it's like very entertainment based and like super fun, super like free, not too incredibly violent, maybe more along the lines of like sexual machismo kind of like vibe, but not too overtly violent. I want to say this playlist, I'm gonna put the playlist on the link tree. Well, not the link tree. I'll probably post it on like Instagram so that y'all can like listen to it. But it's really good. I've been listening to it and I've been really liking it. It's been making me like look out for what songs came out in those years, and I think about like A. Marie, summertime songs, and it's like fun driving music. So if y'all need a good playlist or a good workout playlist, it's actually a pretty good one for working out, because it's pretty much up tempo mostly. There's a couple of songs that are not, but it's fine. They're like groovy at the end of the day. I also really want to talk about an artist that I've been playing a lot over the summer that, I don't know if I've talked about on the podcast, but Marc Anthony is somebody that gets played in my household like all the time. Like, it doesn't matter the occasion. Marc Anthony and Luis Miguel are always playing in my house. Me and my cousin are always joking that we're always playing the same music that our moms play, but it's the truth. Like, we like just love the music, and he's always managed to be on our speakers. We're always playing him, some iteration of like salsa music, and he's really just an icon. So I'm looking forward to new music coming from him, hopefully more in his element, more in his genre. Like, not really, like, I'm not looking for no reggaeton, Maluma covers. Like, I just can't do it. I need like classical, normal music from him. I just can't do the extracurricular. It's too much. I'm not for it right now. Like, maybe in a little bit, but I'm just not for it right now. I need a return to the normalcy for that. A return to traditional values, I guess you can say. But in the best way, I guess. So as far as Spotify is concerned, that's what I've been listening to. As far as like streaming, like I told y'all, like I've just been like Real Housewives, like in the nighttime, that kind of thing, because they're like come on different nights, so it's like you have a new one to watch basically every night of the week. What else? Oh, as far as TV series are concerned, we watched the new Hulu series Candy that has Jessica Biel on it, and it was surprisingly good. I was shocked. It was funny to see her husband make an appearance on it, but I thought overall she did a pretty good job. Like the story overall, I felt could have used a little bit more time in it and could have used a little bit more episodes to build, but I guess it was just like a short limited series. It was good overall if you're interested in the if you're interested in like the crime fiction, that kind of story. Well, it's actually based off of a true story, but of course they dramatized it a little bit more, but I feel like the interpretations were fairly decent. And another show that we've been getting into is, if you have Peacock, they have Dateline The Last Day, which is like some of them are revisiting stories that they've talked about before and re-talking about the last day, which they say is the most important day in the time span or the timeline of a missing person or a murder case. The last day is the most important day. That's where you have the most evidence, the most ability to find them, X, Y, and Z. And the series has been pretty interesting. We're huge fans of Dateline in my house as well. We're crime, like true crime junkies. Like, we love the American Justice, Forensic Files, all of that. Even though sometimes it low-key kind of scares me a little bit, but I don't know. It just, how everyone thinks that they're a detective, so they love the skills. They love like critiquing the police and que pendejos. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about. This and that. Da 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 da. Everyone thinks that they could solve a crime. So we've been on that, and we've been enjoying that, and it's good because like we run through Dateline episodes like crazy. Like, we've literally watched every single one of them. There's not one that we missed. So yeah, we've been totally on it. And just those little things have helped me and helped us just kind of like go through the motions, because this is, turbulent times that we're experiencing. So you got to take your little pleasures, like we talk about all the time, replenish yourself to be able to get back to whatever it is that you do and whatever it is that you work on. And, to avoid the burnout. We're a little bit over the halfway point of summer, so it's important that we're having fun, enjoying ourselves, but making sure that we're not burning ourselves out, and so that we're able to enjoy every bit of the sun in the most healthy and conscious way that we possibly can. Don't forget to wear your sunscreen, y'all, especially during Pride season. It's very important. It's coming up. It's very, very, very close. So it's important that we all handle our business as far as making sure that we're doing the proper bodily care, sunscreen out in the sun, making sure that we're feeding ourselves, nourishing ourselves, drinking water, pacing ourselves if we're having fun and partaking in the beverages in the summer heat, making sure that we're not like overrunning ourselves with the news and getting too worked up about it, and channeling our energy in positive ways to bring about better change, informing others of ways to get involved, ways to call their senators, ways to register other people, and use that kind of energy in that way instead of sulking in the horridness of like the news of it all, the reality of the situation, not succumbing to it, but moving through it. And I think that that's the positive way that we can channel it all. So with all of that being said, we have reached the end of another episode of the Love That podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in to another week's episode. Make sure to come back and meet us next week for a brand new episode. Thank you for all the love and support. Make sure to reach out to us, send us your tweets, send us your Instagram messages, your reviews. Make sure to rate us 5 stars. Make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. Tell a friend to tell a friend, tell family members to tell a loved one. Share the love, spread the love. Make sure to meet me back here next week. I love you all. Stay well. Be careful out there, y'all, because the monkeypox, the COVID variant, just, protect yourselves. Stay safe, be well, and meet me back here for the next one, okay? Love y'all. Bye. Be sure to follow the podcast on social, on Twitter, and on Instagram at The Love That Pod, where we have a direct link in the bio on both of those social media platforms where you can subscribe to our Spotify channel to make sure that you are never missing out on any new episodes of the podcast. The Love That podcast is a show hosted by Diego Romero, produced, mixed, mastered, and editing by Diego Romero.